My name is Dennis Speed, and on behalf of the LaRouche Political Action Committee, I want to welcome everybody today here for our Saturday Dialogue with LaRouche. And our topic for today is worldwide cooperation, why the world needs the exoneration of LaRouche. We're going to do a short introduction and get to our keynote speaker, who was involved in a conference this week which changed the world. And it's important to say a few things about what the context of this is. This is a conference that happened in Milan, Italy. And Milan, Italy has been the site of other conferences that LaRouche and his organization held of a groundbreaking nature. One very important one in which our keynote speaker was also involved, which was a conference on registration and tuning in classical music. Both that conference and this one actually had the same theme. And the conference that she just was part of, together with Helga Zepp-LaRouche, who we'll be hearing from a little later, both these conferences caused tremendous freak out among those who don't support the ideas or the worldview that Lyndon LaRouche represented. Italy has distinguished itself, and its politicians have distinguished themselves by identifying Lyndon LaRouche as the architect of, author of, and appropriate collaborator to ensure the creation of the Belt and Road Initiative in particular. Giulio Tremonti, who had served as Deputy Prime Minister of Italy, as Minister of Finance of Italy, as Minister of Economy and Finance, as Vice President of the Chamber of Deputies, was a collaborator of Lyndon LaRouche, and a few days ago, in an interview with Corriere della Sera, stated that it was LaRouche who first conceived of the idea of the Belt and Road, by which he meant the Eurasian land bridge proposal that he knew that Lyndon LaRouche formulated in the 1990s. And we had a conference. We were involved with the conference, which we helped to organize, which we're going to hear all about, and therefore I'll go right to that. But I want to point out that the actions that were taken by not only Mr. Tremonti, but also Michele Geracci, who is the head of the Task Force China, as it's called, for the government of Italy. These actions have caused at least one faction in Italy, or representatives of a faction in Italy, to respond by saying, well, it's not what he said, it's where he said it. This was a conference that was organized by Lyndon LaRouche's people. And although they said, although Lyndon LaRouche originated this idea, he also says that the Queen of England is the source of evil and many other things. The important point about I want to say as we go to our speaker is, in the United States, we need to find people with the courage and clarity to do what was recently done in Italy. And to that end, today's meeting is intended to initiate that action on the part of Americans to create precisely that sort of initiative. So without anything further, I want to introduce Liliana Gorini. Some of you have heard her before here, who is our representative and the head of our organization, Movisol, in Italy. So Liliana, can you hear us?
Good evening. Thank you, Dennis. Good evening to all of you. Some of you may remember me from a meeting we had about Christopher Columbus 1.5 years ago. And now I actually organized this conference in Milan on Wednesday, the 13th, which was co-sponsored by Movisol, LaRouche's organization in Italy, and the regional government of Lombardy. And it took place in a in the palace of the region Lombardy government in a room which they put at our disposal. They also did the video of the conference, which is available. And you will see actually Helga's speech from that video. And put the announcement of this conference, the title was Italy on the New Silk Road, which is the Italian for the Belt and Road Initiative, was on the official portal of the regional government. They sent it to the press, and we organized our own supporters. There were many institutions which attended this meeting, including a number of Chinese institutions, a number of institutions, Italian institutions which deal with China and the Mediterranean and Africa. And it was important, as the press reported on it, because it put together on the same podium for the first time the Italian government, represented by Professor Michele Geracci. As Dennis said, he is Undersecretary to the Development Ministry in Rome under Di Maio, who is Vice Premier, and is the head of the Task Force China of the Italian government. He is also the actor, the main actor of the Memorandum of Understanding which China and Italy, President Xi Jinping and Premier Giuseppe Conte will sign on next Saturday, on March 22nd, during a state visit in Italy. So it was very important to have him at this conference, because the press, just before the conference, had been taking a stand, many newspapers against Geracci and some in favor of what he's doing, because they know that the investments which China will do on Italian ports, starting with Trieste, Genoa, but also, and this is what he said in our conference in Sicily, in southern Italy, will be the key to relaunch the real economy and to have jobs. And this is very important for Italy, as you can imagine, because we have a very high unemployment rate, 5 million poor, so people are looking forward to the Belt and Road Initiative as a way of developing, of helping, contributing to develop the Italian economy. So Michele Geracci was the first speaker, and next to him was Helga Zepp-LaRouche, chairwoman of Movisol, of the Schiller Institute, sorry. And this is, as Dennis said, this freaked out a number of people, including the Catholic Daily Avvenire, which published this article saying, what is going on now? Is LaRouche giving orders to the Italian government? Well, they're not that far away, because it's, of course, Michele Geracci has been an expert of China for many years. He has been teaching in Shanghai. He has been living in China. He came back, he joined the Italian government, and was able, for example, to convince Vice Premier Di Maio to go with him to China for an official visit. And of course, this memorandum of understanding is his work. But it was very important. It's the first time that the Schiller Institute or Movisol conference is officially attended by government officials. And what the Italian government is doing, as Helga Zepp-LaRouche said during her speech, can actually change the strategic picture, because it is a very strong step in the direction of that new paradigm, which Helga Zepp-LaRouche and Lyndon LaRouche have been promoting now for 30 years, as Tremonti himself admitted in Corriere della Sera. And that's the reason, as Helga was explaining during her speech, why there were so many attacks against, in particularly, Michele Geracci and generally the Italian government for this memorandum of understanding, so much that there were tensions inside the government. There are two vice premiers in Italy. One is Salvini, Matteo Salvini, who is the head of the Lega, and the other one is Luigi Di Maio, who is the head of the Five-Star Party, the two parties which won the elections last year. And they had a quarrel on this because there were strong pressures, in particular from the Bolton people inside the administration. Gareth Marquis was quoted in the Financial Times warning Italy, if Italy joins the Belt and Road, there will be consequences. And this is because 13 European countries already joined the Belt and Road initiatives. Italy is not the first one. For example, Greece, Spain, Portugal, a number of the Eastern European countries. But Italy is the first founding member of Europe and the first member of the G7, so the most industrialized countries doing it. And as Tremonti said himself to Corriere della Sera, this could open the gateway of Europe to China. That's what they're worried about. Or, as Helga Zepp-LaRouche put it in her speech, Italy could become the role model for this cooperation between Italian companies and Chinese companies, which has started already. Before the Memorandum of Understanding, there was, for example, an agreement between the Italian company Bonifica, which was also attending our conference, and the Chinese company Power China to replenish the Chad Lake in Africa. And this is a very important project which could not only help develop Africa, but also reduce the wave of refugees towards Italy and Europe. So there are no real reasons to object this cooperation. There are a lot of pressures from the European Union on Italy to have a bigger growth of the economy and to reduce the refugees. So it is a contradiction, the fact that the European Union at the same time is warning Italy not to join the Belt and Road and is opposing such cooperation with China, which is the key. As Michele Geracci put it in his introductory speech, it is the key not only for northern Italy, so Trieste, Venice, and Genoa, the three main ports in northern Italy, but is also the key for the Mezzogiorno. Initially, China had chosen the port of Augusta, which is in Sicily, because it's clear Sicily is the closest to Africa. And as Geracci said, it would be a natural hub for the development of Africa. But pressures, again, pressures from the European Union, pressures from the establishment and the deep state inside Italy, because we have a deep state also inside Italy, made this project impossible. Now, with the Memorandum of Understanding being signed on March 22nd in Rome during the state visit of President Xi Jinping, they will not be able to stop this cooperation. This is why the Financial Times is completely freaked out. It published threats to Italy, de facto mafioso threats to Italy, not only quoting Gareth Marquis, but also saying that Italy is falling into the debt trap, that this will not give any benefits to Italy. China will colonize Italy. And other newspapers, La Stampa, which is the daily of De Benedetti in Italy, also attacked and took up these same accusations. Handelsblatt, the German financial daily, had a title saying, China tries to split Europe playing the Italy card. So they do see, all of them see very clearly the importance, the strategic significance of this move by Italy, and they are totally freaked out because this new paradigm will crush, finally crush the British Empire, the colonialism, which is not only British, but also French in Africa, and will make that Eurasian land bridge for which Lyndon LaRouche and Helga Zepp-LaRouche have been working through the years possible. So it is not a surprise that at the same time as our conference, a lot of articles started to appear about Lyndon LaRouche. Even if he passed away 1 month ago, they're still saying that LaRouche is determining events in Italy. Why do they say this? I will explain this to you. As Dennis was mentioning, I've been working with Mr. LaRouche for the last 35 years, and I organized for him a number of conferences in Rome and Milan. So he is well known in Italy. He is respected by politicians, by economists, by some press, not Avvenire apparently, but some journalists who interviewed him do appreciate what he has to say. Besides the conference in 1988 in Milan on the question of registration and Verdi tuning, and the one which followed in Busseto, in which LaRouche himself was present, together with the very famous Verdi singers Piero Cappuccilli, baritone, and Carlo Bergonzi, tenor. Some of you may have heard them sing. They're beautiful, were actually beautiful singers. Unfortunately, they also passed away. But in 1997, they were with LaRouche in Busseto to speak about this manual on tuning and registration, which we published also in Italian, and our initiative for the Verdi tuning, which also became a law, legislation proposal at the Senate at that time. And in the year 2007 and 2009, Mr. LaRouche was invited officially by the Italian Parliament and addressed the Defense Committee at the Senate in 2007 and the Finance Committee at the Chamber of Deputies in 2009. And I remember that because when we entered, it was a packed meeting. We thought that this is not our meeting, but it was our meeting. The whole committee was there to listen to LaRouche, who, of course, warned the Italian Parliament of the risk of a financial blowout if the central banks would continue supporting the financial bubble of derivatives and other toxic waste, and proposed first the new Bretton Woods, then the reinstatement of Glass-Steagall as the only way to stop this financial bubble. And at that time, they said, well, this is exaggerated. The press, the economists tell us that the crisis is not so bad. We will have the recovery coming from the US. We have to just wait. A few years later, after the financial collapse of 2008, I spoke with the same members of parliament who invited LaRouche, and they told me LaRouche was completely right. His forecasts were all the time to the point, and we should have listened to him then. We should have adopted his proposals then. The same was said by the government of San Marino, which also was addressed by LaRouche. I met them a few years later. I was invited again, this time for a prize for Amelia Boynton Robinson. And they told me, by the way, I remember very well what Mr. LaRouche said here in this government palace. He was completely right. So whatever Avvenire writes about him, they make fun because they are taking orders from the same deep state and integrity initiative, which is actually also attacking President Trump. The people who have met Mr. LaRouche in these official hearings at the parliament, but also in private meetings, always recognize the fact that he was completely right, and that had we adopted his policies when he proposed them, we for sure wouldn't be in this strategic and economic situation today. So for this reason, I wrote today another letter to President Trump asking for the exoneration of LaRouche, in which I remind him that the Italian people and the Italian politicians do know how important his proposals were, And I also remind him of the fact that 2017 members of parliament, of the Italian parliament, of the European parliament, and also a number of other important European representatives signed in November another letter to President Trump asking him to keep his promise to reinstate Glass-Steagall and to make America great again, but also Italy and the whole world great again. Keep in mind that, and that's also one reason why Avenire is so angry, Glass-Steagall and national banking are part of the official government program of the Conte government. So much that Premier Giuseppe Conte, during his inaugural speech at the Italian parliament, mentioned this point, Glass-Steagall, saying this is the key to safeguard the savings of the population. A number of Italian banks had gone broke because of derivatives, and to relaunch the real economy. And this is probably one of the many reasons why the Italian government is under attack, has been under attack already since it was formed. And now, with the decision to sign this memorandum of understanding with Xi Jinping, which Conte confirmed yesterday, there were doubts, there were some discussions about changing the text of the memorandum of understanding under pressure from the British and under pressure from Bolton. But Conte and Di Maio, the premier and the vice premier of the Italian government, stated yesterday that the memorandum shall be signed without any changes. So the Italian government is resisting to the attacks and to the pressures of the European Union and of the deep state, which is important because, as Helga Zepp-LaRouche said, this can lead to that new paradigm, and it can also move other European countries to do the same. For example, I received yesterday a message of support and congratulations for the conference in Milan from my friend Jacques Cheminade, who is the head of Solidarité Progrès in France. He was a presidential candidate there. Some of you may know him from the conference, recent conference in the United States. And he said, this is very important. We will use what Movisol did in Milan in order to make enormous pressure on the French government to do the same, to sign a memorandum of understanding with China and join the Belt and Road. And also Jacques says that he was very moved by my conclusions at that conference. I dedicated the conference in Milan to Lyndon LaRouche, saying that he recently passed away, that he was beloved and admired and appreciated in Italy as an economist, as the only economist who had foreseen the crisis, and that many people will remember his proposals as he explained them many times in official meetings in Rome at the parliament. So the conference was actually a success, despite all these pressures. For example, the governor of Lombardy was supposed to give the initial greeting, and he didn't do it. But Professor Geracci did come. So the government was there. Helga Zepp-LaRouche was there. She emphasized responding to the accusations of the press, which say, as Handelsblatt did, that Italy and China are splitting Europe on this issue. She said, and rightly so, Europe is already split. There is a split between Northern and Southern Europe because Southern Europe has suffered a lot from the austerity measures of the European Union. And it's not a chance that the same countries which have been so badly hit by austerity, like Italy, Spain, Portugal, and Greece, are the ones which are joining the Belt and Road. It is completely understandable. The European Union is opposing and preventing any investment in Italy. For example, in the reconstruction after the earthquakes, there are areas which are still destroyed and have to be rebuilt. You remember the Morandi Bridge, which collapsed in Genoa with 43 dead people. And many people are saying the European Union is not investing in any infrastructural project. So if China comes and rebuilds, for example, the Morandi Bridge, we will be very happy. We will like it a lot. So this division in Europe is not due to China, but is due to the crazy austerity policy of the European Union, of Juncker, who is planning to invest a lot of money on Greta Thunberg's stupid, hysterical climate change demonstrations, but is not ready to invest in infrastructures. And as Helga Zepp-LaRouche said, there is also East-West division in Europe on the question of refugees, because the European Union doesn't want any refugees in the rich countries. So Great Britain, France, Germany, they don't want any refugees coming to Greece and Italy. But they want the eastern countries of Europe to take them. So they refuse to do so. And we cannot speak of a united Europe. There is no united Europe. There is a military pact between Germany and France, the latest meeting between Merkel and Macron, but there is no Europe. And what Helga Zepp-LaRouche said is we should end finally this Europe of the diktats of the European Union, of the military pacts of Macron, and we should go back to the Europe of the fatherlands of General de Gaulle or De Gasperi in Italy or Adenauer in Germany. That was a concept of a Europe of the fatherlands, which was right. Every country keeps its sovereignty, but we still cooperate. We still cooperate between the various European countries. This would be possible if the new paradigm is realized. And the fact that we had this conference 10 days before the signing of the Memorandum of Understanding between President Xi Jinping and Premier Conte is important, because many people who, for example, look at the news, when they see on the main news, first title, New Silk Road being signed on March 22nd, they immediately think of Movisol and of LaRouche. They connect immediately what we've said in this conference and what is happening officially at the state visit of President Xi Jinping. Not only, but just today, there is an update which I can give you, and then of course I can, after the speech of Helga, I can answer to any questions you may have about Italy. It's not only the New Silk Road. Just today, Alessio Villarosa, who is a member of parliament, but also Undersecretary to the economics minister, announced that he started a committee in the economics ministry about Glass-Steagall, that this was part of the government program, and that now they want to finally work on this, seriously make an analysis of the exposure of banks to toxic waste, to derivatives, and start making a clear separation between banks which invest in productive activities and banks which invest in speculation. And I'm sure that someone will tomorrow in the press say, oh, this is LaRouche again influencing the Italian government. And it's not completely wrong, because we have been working with these members of parliament on the Glass-Steagall issue. I myself was in Alba, in Piedmont, to give a conference on Glass-Steagall together with a member of government, Laura Castelli, who is now in the government of the Five Star Party. So we do we do have an influence on some of these people. And apparently the establishment doesn't like it. The deep state doesn't like it. But guess what? That's the reality. As L'Inchiesta put it, this is not a newspaper, it's a blog. Differently from L'Avvenire, they were at the conference on Wednesday, and they published an article which has an interesting headline. Rather than convenient, the new Silk Road is inevitable. It will change Italy, and it will change also Europe. So this is what the LaRouche movement has been doing and is doing in Italy, thanks to the work of Helga Zepp-LaRouche. And I'm sure that this will have an effect in the United States. Keep in mind that there is a close friendship between Giuseppe Conte, the Premier of Italy, and President Trump. They were very close at the G8 meeting in Canada, and again when Conte visited the White House, because they have similar views, for example, on cooperation with Russia, on moving from the G8 system to the G20 system. They both endorsed this proposal. And I know that President Trump doesn't like the European Union as much as the Italian government doesn't like it. So as Helga Zepp-LaRouche said, the people who are doing pressures on Italy not to sign the MOU with China are not Trump, but are people, neoconservatives around Bolton in particular, who are the same people who are trying to create problems for President Trump with the Russiagate. So the fact that Italy moves in the direction of the new paradigm will be very helpful, I believe, for America and for the administration, because it will support what the president is trying to do in favor of peaceful cooperation. He's trying to make peace with Northern Korea, and they create a war situation in Venezuela. He is trying to have a dialogue with President Xi Jinping and with President Putin of Russia, and they provoke the Russiagate against him. We do know how this works because we see it in Italy too. Michele Geracci did this initiative. He attended our conference and he started to be attacked from all sides. But these attacks prove that we are doing something right. And I am confident that on March 22nd, this historical move of the Italian government will contribute to realizing the dream of Lyndon LaRouche. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Liliana. So we'll go right to Helga's speech in Milan, which is approximately 16 minutes, and then we'll come right back to Liliana for questions. So people should begin to think of questions now. So as soon as the presentation by Helga is over, we'll go right to those questions.
In one sense, quite amusing to see what high waves the possibility of Italy signing the MOU with China is causing right now. Because, you know, when Xi Jinping announced the new Silk Road in 2013 and then proceeded to make treaties with, in the meantime, I think it's 112 countries, an enormous growth, developed 6 major industrial corridors. The Belt and Road Initiative became very quickly the largest infrastructure project in history ever. And the strange thing was that for about 4 years in the mainstream media in the United States and in Europe, there was practically no reporting about this. And then all of a sudden, in a obviously coordinated way, the major think tanks of Europe and the United States started a series of attacks, studies that China is causing countries to fall into the debt trap, that it's just an effort to replace the United States as the dominant force in the world, to become Chinese imperialist, that the Belt and Road projects are not viable, that China is an authoritarian system, that Xi Jinping is a dictator. So all of a sudden you had a barrage of attacks on this concept. The funny thing is that if you would ask and listen to the leaders of the countries cooperating with the Belt and Road on the other side, like the Africans, the Asian countries, the Latin American countries, they would be full of praise and say that with the Chinese cooperation, they have for the first time the opportunity to overcome the underdevelopment and poverty they had suffered as a result of 500 years of Western colonialism and 70 years of IMF conditionalities, which prevented them from exactly having that kind of development. And they were full of praise, calling China a friend. So you get a completely opposite view. I have come to the conclusion that everything the Western media, the mainstream media, are saying about China is fake news and just a lie. And it comes from the fact that many people in the West simply have lost the ability to imagine that any country, leave alone China, could promote something which is indeed for the common good of all of humanity. When Xi Jinping talks about the shared community for the common future of mankind or community of destiny, he means it. And isn't it obvious that in the time of thermonuclear weapons, of international space travel, of conquering all the problems of the world, that we have to think about the one humanity first before we talk about national interest? As a matter of fact, the conception of a win-win cooperation for the Belt and Road Initiative, it has all the economic aspects which are beneficial to all the countries who have participated. But it is much more than that, because from the standpoint of the evolution of mankind, if you take a step back and don't look at the conflict between Marseille and Trieste, which I understand is obviously very important for the Italians, but if you look at the larger point of view, isn't it natural that infrastructure development would eventually open up all continents and connect them? So now all of a sudden you have this eruption of anti-China propaganda, but it comes from the fact that we are now at a point where something happens which happened already 16 times in history, namely that the up to now dominant power is being bypassed by the up to now second largest power. And in history, this led 12 times to war between those two competing powers, and 4 times it was just that the second power bypassed the dominant power without war. China has emphasized many times they don't want, obviously, the 12 to follow the 12 examples where this conflict would lead to war, but they also do not want to simply replace the United States in the role of the leader of an unipolar world, but they want to build a completely new system of international relations based on sovereignty, on respect for the different social system, on non-interference, actually proposing a completely new international system of international relations. So the big question strategically is you have the conflict between the United States and Russia, which is obvious because of the cancellation of the ABM treaty, then the Russian reaction to that, now the cancellation of the INF treaty. So there are many people who think that we are actually close in a worse strategic crisis than during the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis because of the relation of the United States and Russia. But, if you talk to some strategic insiders on both sides of the Atlantic, they easily admit that the much more dangerous conflict is actually the one between the United States and China. Will the United States accept the rise of Asia? And, the Belt and Road Initiative is just the obvious expression of that. Or is that which was said by the Rand Corporation a couple of months ago, that it's better to have the war with China now than in 10 years from now because the casualties will be less. Well, obviously, this is something we have to change, and I think that the best way to change it is indeed, to bring in this reality of a new paradigm of thinking altogether. We have to leave geopolitics. We have to leave the idea that there can be a legitimate interest of one country or a group of countries against another block of countries, because this was what led 2 times to World War in the 20th century. As a matter of fact, I think the potential to overcome this conflict is absolutely there. I know in Europe many people are fainting when you mention the name of President Trump, but President Trump is not seeking confrontation with Russia. As a matter of fact, he wants to have an improved relation with Russia, which he proved in the summit with Putin in Helsinki. And despite the present trade tensions, President Trump always talks about President Xi Jinping as his very good friend, and China being a great country, and that he wants to actually have a good relationship between the United States and China. So the attacks on Italy coming from the White House, the Financial Times mentioned this Garrett Marcus, is not representing the same view as Trump. It comes from a faction of the neocons, which are unfortunately also in the Trump administration. But the factual situation in the United States is very divided. You have the Democrats and the neocons trying to get Trump out of office with Russiagate. But, on the other side, I think President Trump has proven a tremendous sustainability against the efforts to drive him out of office. And his supporters are absolutely backing him, and the chances that there will be a second Trump administration are actually very, very high. Now, one of the accusations against China and the Belt and Road Initiative is that it would divide Europe. Now, I think everybody knows Europe is divided already without China. You have the North-South conflict because of the EU austerity policy, which impoverished Greece, Italy, Spain, Portugal, did not give development to the East European countries. So they are now happy to cooperate with the Belt and Road Initiative because the EU did not provide these things. Now, the second area of division is obviously the migrant issue, where you have the division between East and West. The East European countries do not want to have any part of the proposed quota system of the EU. Now, what Italy is actually doing in this context is really a role model, because the kind of cooperation between Italian firms and Chinese firms in the development of Africa is actually the only human way to address the refugee question. So you have right now 13 countries who already signed the MOU with China. You have now with Italy the first G7 country, which is really overrated because the G7 is no longer that important as compared to the G20, for example. And you have many ports. Mr. Geracci said it's actually all the ports of Europe who are already wanting to be a hub between not only the new Silk Road over the land route, but also hubs to the maritime Silk Road, Portugal and Spain becoming the hub for all the Spanish-speaking and Portuguese-speaking countries around the world. So there is a complete changed attitude developing very quickly. There are also, even in Germany and France, the two countries which are now trying to put the brakes on the most, apart from the EU Commission, there are many cities who are absolutely recognizing their self-interest to cooperate with the Belt and Road Initiative. You have 3 states in Germany, Schleswig-Holstein, Bavaria, and Brandenburg, who all the time have huge delegations back and forth. You have many cities where the mayors are complete fans of the cooperation with China, and it is an increasing dynamic, which is more rapidly than you would think. So if you would ask my prognosis, I think the perspective of unifying Europe, not necessarily under an EU bureaucracy, but in the conception of de Gaulle, more like a Europe of the fatherlands, uniting with China, with Russia, with the Belt and Road Initiative, the Eurasian Economic Union, and European countries to cooperate fully in this new paradigm is absolutely there. But I think that that is also the only way to how Europe can impact this strategic situation. Because if you had a united Europe of the fatherlands cooperating with the Belt and Road Initiative, including Germany and France, that would be the best way to get the United States to also give up their opposition, which I said, is not Trump himself, but these other forces, and get the United States to join the new paradigm. And I think this is the only hope we have to avoid a catastrophe, where we would end in World War III with nuclear weapons, meaning the extinction of civilization. So in that sense, what Italy is doing right now is of the greatest historical importance, because Italy, with what you are doing, with the MOU, but also with the joint ventures with China in Africa, can become the role model for all the other European countries. But the new Silk Road is not just an economic concept. Obviously, infrastructure, investment, all of this is extremely important as the backbone, but it has a much more and not so known cultural, moral dimension, which I think is best expressed in the fact that the Chinese thinking is actually based on the Confucian theory, namely that you absolutely must have harmony among all the nations, developing all in a harmonious way. And when some think tanks say that there is now a competition of systems between the Western liberal model and the state-guided model of the Chinese state economy, well, what they really mean is that China has developed its whole policy based on the Confucian orientation, which means that the state is also in charge of the moral improvement of its population through the aesthetical education. As a matter of fact, Xi Jinping has said repeatedly that he puts the highest emphasis on the aesthetical education because the result of this is the beauty of the mind and the beauty of the soul.
Quando i vari centri studi e pensatori parlano di competizione di sistemi, dimenticano il fatto che la Cina ha sviluppato una politica basata su Confucio e il fatto che lo Stato sia responsabile anche dello sviluppo morale ed estetico e dell'educazione estetica della popolazione. E questa è una garanzia.
The goal is the beauty of the mind.
E che l'obiettivo di tutta questa politica sia la bellezza della mente.
You see, I understand Italian.
Capisco l'italiano, almeno quello che manca.
So the problem is, the reason why some people in the West regard that as a competition is because the Western liberal, neoliberal and liberal philosophy has moved away from that conception. We are no longer humanists. We are no longer thinking like during the Italian Renaissance or the German classical period, but we have replaced that with a liberal thinking of everything is allowed. Every degenerate form of culture is allowed. Everything goes. I don't want to elaborate that, but if you look at the violence, the pornography in the entertainment, we don't have to worry. We will lose that competition of the systems simply because we are not taking care of our future generations, but allowing them to morally completely decay. And that is why, I think that we have to understand that the only way how Europe can persist in the coming future is not through military power. What Mr. Macron is proposing is ridiculous. But we will preserve our European culture only if we return to the greatest tradition of our own history, meaning reviving the spirit and the ideas and principles of the Italian Renaissance, of the École Polytechnique in France, of the German classical music, literature, poetry. Only if we rise again to our best traditions can we persist in the coming world. So I think that the cultural dimension of the new Silk Road is as important, if not more important, than the question of economics.
I thought we were going to show the last part of Liliana translating that. While people come to the microphone, and she's back, right? Liliana, are you there? I just want to make sure we can hear you.
I'm back. I'm back.
She's back. We'll make sure we get the audio. We're good?
Can you hear me?
Yes, now we know we can hear you. Yeah, right. So we're going to questions. So just want to point out 2 books which are available out at the table. One of them called Toward a New Council of Florence, which I want to introduce. And this was says, on May 5th, 1989, Helga Zepp-LaRouche delivered a speech entitled Nicholas of Cusa and the Council of Florence to a conference in Rome, Italy, sponsored by the Schiller Institute to commemorate the 550th anniversary of the Council of Florence. And then it says, this is by Will Wirtz. Inspired by her presentation, I decided to put my time in prison to good use by translating those works of Cusanus to which I could gain access and which had not yet been translated into English. He stated just in a paragraph just prior to that, on January 27th, 1989, Mr. LaRouche and several of his political associates, including myself, were unjustly imprisoned after being falsely convicted of conspiracy to commit mail fraud. The real reason for our imprisonment was that we had incurred the wrath of powerful political enemies inside and outside of the United States government because of our fight for a policy of world peace based upon economic development. So this book is available outside, and I'll say a bit more at the end about it. The second one is The Science of Christian Economy and Other Prison Writings of Lyndon LaRouche Jr. This was a book of writings comprised and composed by Mr. LaRouche in jail at the exact same time. And on the cover of that book is seen the Brunelleschi Dome of Florence. So the theme that we're hitting today is a theme that should resonate very much in America, because the issue of the presidency of Donald Trump is precisely defined by what was done to Lyndon LaRouche, including his incarceration. The attempts against the president and the presidency today are an echo of that campaign that was done then. Okay, so we'll go to our first question.
Yes, this is John Sigerson. Ciao, Liliana. It has always amazed me. It's breathtaking to when I consider the fact that, as you know, our organization in Italy is so small. It's tiny. It's you and maybe a couple of other people, whereas here in the United States, we have a relatively large organization, although still rather small. But it's breathtaking what has happened in Italy in terms of the resonance of Lyndon LaRouche's ideas. And if you could comment on what it is in Italian history and culture that makes it that has made it possible for this kind of resonance to occur in Italy specifically. Thank you.
Sure. Well, I think it's what Dennis was showing on the cover of Lynn's book, The Science of Christian Economy, at the Brunelleschi Dome. The fact that the Italian Renaissance was based on this concept of imago viva Dei, that every single individual is in the image of God, and that individuals can make history. as it happened in the Renaissance. People like Brunelleschi with his buildings, Leonardo da Vinci with his paintings, with his musical instruments, with his De Voce, his treatise on the human voice, which created bel canto. Each one of them, I can mention many more, of course. Now I'm mentioning the ones which come to mind. Each one of them changed history as an individual. And well, Italians have a little bit this reputation, which is not always good, of being individualistic. But in some cases, in particular when you do good, when you organize, for example, in LaRouche's movement, this can be helpful because you don't need an army of people. Like for this conference, it was myself and Massaron, the same guy who collected the 217 signatures for Glass-Steagall, who were brought to Congress by European Member of Parliament Zanni in November. He first spoke to Governor Fontana, then we met people in the regional government of Lombardy. We convinced them to organize this conference with us, emphasizing the importance of the New Silk Road for Italy. We told them we had no money, that we are a few people. I told them all we can bring is like 50 people to the conference. So you have to organize the institutions, you have to organize the press. We cannot put any money into this, but I can translate because it's my job. I do this for a living, for free. I can translate Mrs. Helga Zepp-LaRouche for free. And this is the contribution Movisol will give. And they actually did it. Of course, it was a discussion, but it was very similar for the other initiatives. For example, Dennis mentioned when Will and Lynn were in jail, other people, Mike, I met some of them. I went to jail to see them when I was in the United States. On that occasion, 80 members of the Italian parliament signed a letter to, at that time, President Clinton, to free LaRouche, including the head of the Christian Democracy, Flaminio Piccoli, who was a friend of LaRouche's. He met him very often in Rome. He gave a press conference at the parliament. But also in this case, it was the initiative of one person who took this question seriously. He said he read what Ramsey Clark had said, that this was the most political motivated trial in the history of his career, and he was also a justice minister in the United States. He took it seriously. These people was in the Radical Party, so they were not at all in favor of LaRouche on many issues, but they said, this is incredible. This is clearly politically motivated, so we volunteer to help you collect these signatures. And the same happened with the Glass-Steagall. The important thing, but I think this is something you Americans can do very well. I normally use actually America as an example in Italy. I say when I was in the US, what I liked is when people are convinced of something, then they do. They don't chat so much. They say, okay, let's do it. Let's get the state legislator. Let's go to my elected parliamentarian. Let's kick some ass. This I actually learned from you guys in America.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Hi, Liliana. Dick Conley here, and I have a couple of points. One is Italy, as I understand, still has a robust manufacturing sector. Correct me if I'm wrong. And would that be responsible for, or at least partly responsible for being able for the population to harmonize with the physical economy that China's doing? along the lines of LaRouche's physical economy, science of, he's written about economics. He is primarily an economist, which is what allows him to make his forecasts. So I'd like you to comment on that. And how Italy was able to resist, for instance, back a while ago, about 25, 30 years ago, they had this yacht, Queen Elizabeth's yacht, where they had Draghi and some others basically commit treason against the state of Italy. And I imagine those are still the enemies today, and their next generation, perhaps. But those two things would be. I don't know if you can handle those as a question.
Sure, no problem. Thank you. Well, on the robust manufacturing sector, yes, it is still there, particularly the machine tool sector in northern Italy, in Veneto, Piedmont, and Lombardy, which are, by the way, the three regions which endorse the New Silk Road the most. We had the messages of greetings and support for the conference from the governors of these three regions. They are still there, but in the last 10 years, as a result of the policy of the European Union, many of these firms, which, as LaRouche had said at that time, were family businesses. He went to see some of them in Veneto. He was invited by the Chamber of Commerce there, and he visited, because some of these industrialists, small and medium enterprises, were our supporters. And he went to see these industries, and he said they are wonderful because they are family enterprises. They are really proud of what they created. They export to China, they export to Germany, they export to the United States. And the technological level is good. But some of these businesses have gone broke, not because they are not good, but because banks stopped giving them credit. Sometimes they needed credit to pay for clients and customers who pay 90 days later. And since the crisis in 2008, banks simply stopped giving this credit to small and medium-sized enterprises, even if they were very good. So someone broke, and there were 500 head of these industries who committed suicide, because it was, for them, it was a dishonor, it was a terrible thing to lose their company. This was their life. So the level of the technological level of the industries is good in northern Italy. In southern Italy, there is still a lot to do. But the way the European Union and the European Central Bank, since you spoke of the Britannia, has been sabotaging exactly this model, which is typical of northern Italy, of the manufacturing sector. As to the Britannia, you were referring to this meeting in '92 on the yacht of the Queen, the Britannia, off the coast of Rome, in Civitavecchia, in which they discussed privatizing all state industries in Italy and selling off our state assets. Yes, the people who did that, unfortunately, are still in power, not in Italy. Draghi is the head of the European Central Bank. And he has been imposing, for example, he imposed the government of Monti. He simply dictated a government crisis and a change of government in Italy. This is how the Troika, the European Central Union, the European Central Bank, and the International Monetary Fund function. They simply come to governments and say, we don't like your policy. We want you to get this premier who will do this and this. And in the letter Draghi sent, at that time Berlusconi was at of the government, he explicitly said, you have to do a policy of austerity, you have to do privatizations, exactly the Britannia policy. And this is still the case, except with the new government of Premier Conte and Salvini and Di Maio, they started to oppose that. They explicitly attacked Draghi and the Britannia plot on a number of occasions, saying we want to go back to national sovereignty.
Next questions. Yeah, we have another. We have someone else.
Hi, Liliana. My question is on the lines like Helga had talked before about how there was a degeneracy in the Italian culture away from the original Italian Renaissance, and that, and my question is basically on this line of where is there a sense, are you getting the sense that there's still a love of the Renaissance and this bel canto tradition, and that people there are wanting to revive this?
Well, on the one side, it is true. There has been a degeneracy, particularly in the youngest generation. This is a generation which is mostly unemployed, comes out of school or university, no job, and tends to deny or even not to know our cultural heritage. They tend to go to the disco, they tend to go to the happy hour. Their life is spent in pleasure, alcohol, and discotheque. And that is very bad. That's exactly the opposite of what the Renaissance was all about. They learn about it in school, but for many of this, I don't say the whole youth, because some people are still, they still react well, like we have on TV, some actors who recite Dante Alighieri, and not only on TV, in the piazza in Tuscany. This is mainly in Tuscany, which is where most of the Renaissance men were. A lot of people go there. They appreciate when they explain the Commedia of Dante and recite it. And for example, when there was flooding in Florence, a lot of people reacted to the flooding and mobilized to save the works of art. The same happened when the earthquake happened in L'Aquila and Abruzzo, where there are a lot of churches, small Renaissance paintings, but important for the population. They do react when they see it threatened, but it's mostly the older generation. I have to say, the youngest generation is a victim of the general pessimism, cultural pessimism, and the generation which we see in culture, not only in Italy, but all over the world, I fear.
The bad pop culture from the United States was not only influencing Italy, but had a bad effect on Germany as well. So part of the thing I was thinking about is that if we could actually, we're doing a lot of work here with our course and things like that, so that we can make the US better, so we stop corrupting you guys so much.
Keep doing that. That is very good. And people in Italy listen. We publish the videos of your concerts in New York, and they like them a lot. So it helps you, but it also helps us. Because, for example, some of the Verdi works are now performed in Italy thanks to the Chinese, because it seems that the Chinese appreciate Verdi and our opera more than the Italian. The Italian state is not giving any money to opera, while the Chinese sometimes finance this kind of cultural events. So there are people in the world who still appreciate our culture.
Yeah. I think that having a Mao dictatorship ban classical music in China for 30 years might have helped that.
There is not Mao anymore.
Good afternoon, ma'am. I'm a singer, and I'm interested in learning about the Verdi tuning. More so, how did Verdi come up with the premise that the hit should be at a certain level, and what is it at this particular state in Italy now concerning the tuning that we at the LaRouche Institute, Schiller Institute, try to abide by?
Yeah, that's an interesting story which I love to tell, because it involves again Lyndon LaRouche. I was in Virginia in 1986 or 87, and we had for the first time Mozart's Requiem at C256. I was in the chorus then. We were rehearsing, and John will remember, he was conducting it. And Lynn was coming to the rehearsals and saying, I do not care, put scotch tape on your bassoons, do whatever you do, but stick to a C256, because otherwise you will destroy the voices and the music. And in many occasions, sometimes Lynn was saying things which we didn't understand completely, but we knew he was right. So I said, well, if this is the case, I will find proof, evidence of this in Italy. And I did. When I went back to Milan, I asked my father, who was working at the Milan Conservatory, to look up under diapason, tuning fork, in the library. And he found a letter of Giuseppe Verdi in 1884, written to the government, to the music committee of the government then, demanding that they establish A432, which equals C256, as the scientific pitch for all orchestras in Italy, because he was conducting his own operas, for example, in Naples and other theaters, and it was jumping from the French diapason of A435 to a very high diapason of A450, which is what Karajan reached in Berlin. And he said, this is not possible. Music is a universal language, so you cannot have a note which is called A in Paris and is a B flat in Rome. I want all the music world to have the same tuning, and the fact that you lower the tuning will not diminish the sound by decreasing the brilliance. On the contrary, it will make the sound more majestic and beautiful. This is in his letter. So I took this letter, I did a petition out of it for all singers, opera singers, and 2,000 singers from all over the world, starting with Capuccilli, Renata Tebaldi, Pavarotti, Bergonzi, Placido Domingo, Montserrat Caballé, you name them, the most famous singer from all over the world. As soon as they heard that Verdi had written a letter in favor of lowering the tuning, started not only to endorse our petition, but in some cases, the case of Bergonzi, he started a strike. He was singing in Florence, which is also one of the highest pitched theaters, together with Salzburg and Berlin. And he told me in an interview when I met him that he called the oboe player, because the oboe player is the one which gives the aid to the orchestra, in his dressing room, and told him, either you lower the pitch of this oboe or I go home. I just refuse to sing. And Placido Domingo, after our conference in Milan, wrote a similar threat, which was covered. This was covered all over the press, Le Monde, New York Times. I mean, the biggest newspapers covered our conference and the petition, of course, because there were so famous singers endorsing it. And that's how it started. It started with our Schiller Institute conference in Milan, and it continued, of course, with our own chorus, which ever since the conference started to perform at A432.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. How is it in Italy now? Do they still abide by Verdi's wishes in Italy?
This is unfortunate. Italy is the country of the Renaissance and also many contradictions. When we had this conference, two members of Senate jumped on the case and came to me and said, we will present a legislation. I remember them, Senatore Mezzapesa and Boggio. They did a legislation in the Senate to go back to Verdi tuning, and then they started to get pressures from the wind instrument producers because they had stocks of instrument at A440. And because of the pressures, which I assume, I don't want to be too nasty, but I assume involved also money given to these politicians, they changed their own legislation from A432 to A440, which doesn't really change anything. It's not a scientific pitch, it's a compromise solution. And so the legislation was approved, but it didn't change anything. So what happened actually during the Verdi years is that a number of theaters in Italy started to perform at A432 by themselves. That's why I mentioned the Chinese investing, because we have a number of conductors in Busseto. There is a Verdi festival, and in other places, Parma, who want to perform at A432, but the state wouldn't give them financing to change the instruments. So they are looking for the help of the Chinese to do that. The debate is still there, but it is a financial question because some of the wind instruments have to be rebuilt. You cannot just change them a little bit.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Very good. Other questions? Because I have a question if people don't have anything. Yeah, Liliana, I wanted you to comment on something. It's interesting to look at the idea that in the origin of the Renaissance, the contact between China and Italy, the East and the West, was the motivator, and in fact, it was Cusa who developed the first ideas of the sovereignty of the nation state. And then once again, now we're looking at that same process. At that time, the idea of potential relative population density that Lynn was known for, that he invented, but it was shown, it came about after the 1439 Council of Florence, that we saw this massive increase in population, rates of development and rates of change in technology and population density. You mentioned the idea about the collapse of the generations in Italy, and I know that the people that attacked us, including from the Italian Bishops' Conference, the thing that's notable, of course, is that recently the Vatican had become pro-Gaia, the idea, in other words, of population reduction, while, of course, not explicitly stated perhaps by the church or something like that. I'm not saying that happened. Nonetheless, that seems to be the battleground right now about the question of the integrity of the human being. But I just wanted to ask you to comment, because if you look at those bookends of the period of the Renaissance, from basically really even the time of Brunelleschi, going back between, when he first worked on the dome from 1436 I mean, when that dome was because it was finished. If you look at it, it's clear that is the thing. We're seeing something like the same thing now. And I just wanted you to say whatever your thoughts are about that.
Yes, it is true. And that's what I didn't write the question of population growth, but I did write a letter to the editor of Avvenire, very angry letter about the slander against LaRouche. First of all, because it's not very Christian to attack someone who just passed away. But also because this I couldn't say, but I couldn't say because they were private meetings, but Mr. LaRouche, among the many meetings he had in the parliament, he was also received in the Vatican, and people at that time, this was, sorry, Pope Wojtyła was there, John Paul II. His reports and his analysis, I'm sorry, I'm a bit sick, was appreciated then. With Bergoglio, as I was discussing today with a journalist, I was asking him what he thinks about the fact that the Daily of the Catholic Bishop Conference reports the line of the Queen of England and of the Deep State and of Integrity Initiative about LaRouche. And he said, well, these guys are Freemasons. Ever since Bergoglio joined Greta Thunberg and the freaks of the climate change, the church is going downhill. They now decided also to open the files on Pius the 11th, which means that they will give in also to the question of the so-called support to the Nazis. So they are simply selling off anything which has been Catholic for the last 40 years. And this has an effect on the population. There was a youth meeting recently with Pope Francis, and they don't give them really indications. They don't tell them what to do. We could do better than the Pope with this youth. They just invite them to be good, but at the same time, it is true, the fact that the church endorsed this line of the climate change, even some cardinals inside the Vatican said that this means that we are forced to reduce the population. There is a book which came out in Germany together with this campaign of Greta Thunberg, and it says, the translation is childless by decision. It says that every child you put in the world is increasing the level of CO2. So you're killing the environment if you have children. So the line is, let's not have children. This is the opposite of what first the church in general is saying, and as you said, is the opposite of the meaning, the true meaning of the Renaissance, which was not only to create a cultural revolution, but also to create the economic conditions so that the population could not only grow, but also live with a better living standard. Remember that Leonardo da Vinci was not only a painter, but he also was an engineer. He was building essentially projects, infrastructural projects about water, so to allow a bigger population to live better. And they are essentially denying and crushing the cultural heritage and the basics concept of the Catholic Church, which used to be grow and make children and create a family and populate the world. They are now asking to depopulate the world.
Okay. Liliana. It's Diane Sayre with a question from Amber Smith in Florida, who writes, first of all, profound thanks for your single-handedly determined work of love over the years in Italy. My question is how we can see the success of the exoneration for the ideas of Mr. LaRouche by the legal exoneration here in the US political and juridical system. How do you envisage the collaborative fight with a quite broad population of Italian Americans and others, of course, in the US, which can gain much from the guidance of this great historical example? A concurrent fight there can and will help the process here. My husband and I have our hearts particularly with the struggle of the African refugees and the devastated region of the critical Mezzogiorno, which we have grown to love so well. I have never met such a loving people, so impoverished, but so rich in other great human attributes, and very much want this fight to succeed on its various multifaceted levels.
Well, I was discussing, hi Diane, first of all, nice to see you. I was discussing this before the meeting with Elliot on the phone, because one idea we had is if you organize the Italo-American community, as you did at the time of the Columbus, was that you can use on this question of the exoneration a letter to President Trump, which I wrote today. You will get it because now it's in the hands of Elliot and Dennis. But Helga did like it, I asked her. And the idea is to say what I said in the beginning, that Mr. LaRouche has been received in Italy with the greatest honors. He was considered a very important economist. If his ideas had been realized, we wouldn't be in this situation. So I wrote to President Trump. I addressed you twice, one time on Columbus, when they were destroying the statues of Columbus in many cities, and he did intervene and stop this, which is very important. The second time in November with these 270 signatures for Glass-Steagall. And now I'm asking you, as chairwoman of Movisol and as representative of those hundreds of members of parliament to listen to LaRouche and found that he was right, to exonerate LaRouche. I think, as in the case of the parole, which was granted to Lynn after thousands of representatives, elected representatives, including these 80 members of government from Italy, bombarded President Clinton to grant him parole, he did. So this could be a similar thing. You can use this letter maybe and have people who have Italian origin, or even if they don't have an Italian origin, but they like the idea, to send it to the White House. Because I think, first of all, we have to create a public debate on this, like Tremonti did with his interview to Corriere della Sera. I don't know if he did it for the exoneration, probably not, but he certainly felt the need when he heard that LaRouche had passed away to say something about him. We can create a debate with letters, like Helga was saying. It's important to have more people writing personal memories of him, of what he did in many places, in many countries, but also it's a political thing. And what I emphasize in my letter, which is what we have emphasized in our pieces, and I think it's very important, is to make clear that the same people who railroaded and jailed LaRouche and his collaborators, including William Weld and Robert Mueller, are the people who are out to get President Trump. I didn't write get, I wrote something better. But it's important for him to understand that by exonerating LaRouche, he is giving a final blow to this network, which is British directed, which has created the Russiagate and which has tried has been trying to impeach him for the last 2 years, even if they have no evidence whatsoever. As in the case of Lin, they didn't have any evidence, and yet they jailed him. So this connection is important. I think if President Trump would do such a gesture, exonerating LaRouche, this would be a political act. It would be understood by the rest of the world as a political act. Let's stop this, all what has happened in the last 2 years, and let's go ahead instead with what Trump had promised to do during his campaign.
Thank you.
Very good. Was there another question or not? Okay, what I want to do then, if that's the case, let me simply say one thing here, and Liliana, you are certainly well, welcome to respond. Someone texted me during the proceedings, and I just want to read what exactly United States Attorney General Ramsey Clark said about the Lyndon LaRouche case. He characterized it as, quote, as involving a broader range of deliberate cunning and systemic misconduct over a longer period of time, using the powers of the federal government's resources than any other prosecution by the United States government in my time or to my knowledge, end quote. Okay, so that was the exact statement about the case. We do have something that we will be playing in a few minutes from Lynn. But before we go to that, because I don't know what Liliana's time is like, I'd like you now, Liliana, to just give us any sort of anything that you haven't said or anything that you'd like to add to what you've said. You're certainly welcome to stay with us when we play this, but I figured this is a good time for you to kind of give whatever statement you'd like to everybody here.
Yes, I can only repeat what Helga said at the end of her speech here in Milan. The Belt and Road Initiative, and as we call it in Italy, the New Silk Road, is very important for economic reasons, but the dialogue of cultures, the idea of Xi Jinping about educating, an aesthetical education of the population and the beauty of the mind is as important. And this is, in a certain sense, what unites us, the Schiller Institute, Movisol, the LaRouche PAP, the LaRouche movement in the United States, in Europe, and in the rest of the world, including in Africa, in Russia, wherever we have contacts, in China. Because through this dialogue of cultures, which is part of the Memorandum of Understanding, I'm sure, that they will sign in Rome on March 22nd, we can finally defeat this culture of pessimism, including the idea that the world is dying, that the climate is changing. We can fight this cultural degeneration, the pop culture, the rock culture, the whatever, the stupidity culture, which is spreading so quickly, entertainment, soap operas, anything which is destroying, is not creating the beautiful mind, but is creating the stupid mind. And we can stop the confrontation policy of the deep states, of the neoconservatives, of the Democrats, which have shown to be more warmongers than the Republicans in some cases, particularly Hillary Clinton. And we can have that renaissance which Leonardo da Vinci and others made possible in Italy. I am confident, I'm truly confident, as Helga said, her prognosis is that this is possible. We have just to be sure and determined in going ahead with this, with the new paradigm.
Thank you, Liliana. I want to have everybody join me in thanking Liliana for what she's presented today.
You're welcome.
What we're going to do right now is show something from Lynn, and partially this comes from the actions that you are aware occurred in New Zealand, because it's a sort of clash of civilizations scenario, being blamed on Donald Trump, by the way, in case some of you didn't know that. But it's an answer that Lynn gave to one of our members and associates who found himself in a potentially sticky situation in a particular discussion about religion. Lynn had apparently made the statement or written something in which he had also made the statement that God is a Christian. So you'll see the exchange, and you'll see what he does with this. And we're going to play this because when we talk about exonerating Lyndon LaRouche, we want everybody to understand it's not that it's that easy to do, because you also have to be willing to stand with some very tough statements that Lynn sometimes made and be ready to either defend those statements or recognize that in your discussion with people, you're going to say, we don't care whether you agree with him or not. He has to be exonerated. And so let's play that so people will see exactly what I mean. Go ahead.
I'd like to thank you for the opportunity. Name's Marty Rowland from the New Orleans chapter, Schiller Institute, the group that helped defeat the goofball Woody Jenkins for Senate. But one of the thing I wanted to bring up is about the Lynn's article about Michael Novak. And there was a way of reading the material to where I know it as a person reading this, but there's, I think, a higher cardinality that I need to read this in order to organize around it. And particularly about the quote on about what Christians believe. And specifically, it seems like it's a tautology in the sense that we define God in terms of Christian principles, but then there's a sentence here that says, for reasons I shall supply, Christianity knows, as a matter of reason, not a mere opinion, that God is a Christian. And so here I am in New Orleans with Nation of Islam, with Jewish groups, and this wide variety of people who call themselves Christians, is that the pedagogy that I would use being confronted, given this somebody to read, and they say, what do you mean that God's a Christian? So I guess what I want Lynn to describe is that method that I would use, or what is it that it's not a tautology?
Okay, gotcha. Well, first of all, God is also an ecumenicist. You see, the nature of Christianity, the nature of Christ, is to free man from a lot of things that were very bad. First of all, the Israelites had a bad belief. It was racist. The belief that any group of people has a covenant with God separate from the rest of the human race is wrong. It's immoral. It has nothing to do with God. And one suspects that that particular aspect of the writings may have been inserted in the 7th century BC in Babylon, when leading writers of Israel were taken to Babylon as captives and were told to rewrite the Mosaic texts. And you'll find, for example, an example of this is in the book of Genesis, one of the most flagrant ones. You have two completely different creation stories in the book of Genesis. One is in chapter 1, 26 to 28, on man. Man and woman were created in the image of God, were made in the image of God, and with a quality to exert dominion over the universe. Then you come along and you find another version of creation. God created Adam out of mud, not out of godly material. and he gave Adam a ribbing, which is the first marriage. And then Adam raised Cain until he was no longer able. Now, since it is a known point, I came across this question in a clear way, this specific question on Genesis, back in the 1950s, after I'd completed these discoveries in economic science and related matters. I picked myself and said, okay, how do I extend what I know about economy in terms of principles of human behavior into pre-modern times? So I said, well, okay, we have, in the Middle East, we have all these cuneiform clay tablets which have been unearthed. And I knew something of what these clay tablets represented, both from the Sumerian version and so forth. I knew how they had to be read. So I set myself a project. I would get this information from clay tablets, and I would be able to construct a model of how these economies had worked based on these statistics which are in these clay tablets, which had been preserved because they were clay, whereas there had been on skins, there had been parchment records, but the parchment doesn't last like clay does, and therefore all the parchment records which are kept by the other people of the region, especially the Semitic population, were destroyed. And the only reason we had later, because on the Assyrian Empire, they revived the clay tablet, the cuneiform tablet, for religious reasons, or for religious cult reasons. And therefore, long after parchment had been well established from the Phoenicians on throughout the region, or actually the Canaanites, which was their real name at the time, that the Assyrians went back to the clay tablets, and therefore we had a whole new version of clay tablets of later vintage from the Syrian area, which also were copies, in a sense, putative copies of the histories and so forth of Sumerians and other ones, which a lot of our knowledge about the early Babylonian, Akkadian cultures are based on these secondary copies of these clay tablets. And we ran into, of course, then the accounting tablets, which we got from some areas, or later dug out in the 1940s, 1950s, from the areas involving the ancient Hittite Empire, or the Hittite Kingdom. And we had a lot of records from that area of these, which were actually bills of exchange, with a two-part clay bill of exchange. You had, inside you'd have the contract, on the outside you would have the envelope, which is baked around it. And if you broke the envelope, you were committed to the contract. So these guys, you had this simple clay tablet bill of exchange was put in, which gave a lot of insight. So I began getting deeply involved in this material, and found out that a lot of the stuff that was in the Old Testament had nothing to do with the Hebrews, but was something that was stuck in there from these heathens, these terrible heathens, these Babylonians. Then I found out that this had all happened in the 7th century, when the Israeli captives had been forced to rewrite the religion. And what we have as a large part of the Old Testament are materials which are actually written into various books, and there are two primary versions of the Old Testament. You know, the one is the Egyptian Talmud, the other is the Babylonian Talmud, and they conflict in lots of ways. They're different stories. And you have the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is actually a Gnostic cult, which was not either anything at that time. It wasn't Christian, it wasn't Israeli, it wasn't Hebrew. But it collected all these writings and put them in copper plates and so forth. And they won't release them because it would expose a certain number of frauds on this Babylonian Talmud business. So therefore, it was obvious to me that you had certain parts of the Old Testament which are completely inconsistent with each other, absolutely contradictory, like these two creation stories, the creation of man. But there were some things you could verify, and there were some things you knew were wrong, which should never have been published. They should have been cleaned out. They should have been recognized long ago, because they're not consistent with theology as we understand it. So that convinced me more than anything else that in dealing with these biblical stories, you have to know what you're doing. You have to know of your own knowledge that it's true. And you don't know, you weren't there, you didn't see it happen. You know that many of the accounts are false. Therefore, you cannot believe it on the authority of it being the Bible. But you have to know of your own knowledge that it's true. Now, in the case of the New Testament, there's not much of a problem there, unless you're an illiterate. Because we know the entire culture of the period of the New Testament was Greek culture. And therefore, if you understand the Greek mind and the mind of the Hellenistic period, then you know what the state of mind is from which communications are being made in that period. We also have a very good record on the New Testament in terms historically. It came in a historic period. The personality of Christ and the Christians and that in the first half century are very well documented. So this is not something you have to simply believe, well, some guy existed, but the Roman records don't show any existed or anything like that, Jesus Christ and the Christians existed. No, this is well known. For example, the Apostle John lived into the 90s, and he was the leader of Christianity until the time he died. That's a century. Paul was executed, Peter were executed, but the circumstances, the places, their associations are well known. So these documents are understandable. The New Testament you can rely upon. The Old Testament you cannot rely upon. There are too many of this, for example, lots of the book of Daniel, for example, comes from Babylonian origins, does not come from any what would be putatively legitimate origins. Some of it's false, known to be false historically. But you can rely upon Christianity. You can rely on certain parts of the Old Testament. For example, Genesis 1 is absolutely consistent, not in terms of the dates, because they tampered with the creation dates, in a sense, in these things. You had this famous case of Archbishop Usher, who tried to prove that God was standing in Mesopotamia when he created the universe. That's literally what the implication of the original story is, on which some of these things are based. So the question is, what do you know? Not what do you choose to believe, or what spoken authority, or what written authority, or what teaching instructed you to believe something. What do you know? Believe nothing you don't know. And as Plato said in dealing with Socrates, know yourself. That is, know how you know. And that's the meaning of what I said, the core meaning. Is I know God as a Christian, because I know the beliefs which we associate with the New Testament correspond to what I know. Not on the basis of some standing up in church and confessing their sins and saying, I want to give testimony. But I know, as a matter of scientific fact, that this is true. Other people may not. But I also know the nature of creation. And I also know that Christianity is concerned to save all people, that all people are considered our responsibility. And Christianity extends its grace to all people. And therefore, in dealing with people who have a different religious persuasion, especially monotheists, what you must do is don't try to resolve the differences in doctrine. Concentrate on those principles in which there should be agreement. And these are principles concerning, for example, Genesis 1, 26, 28. Man and woman are made in the image of God to exert dominion in the universe. And that man must be so treated. All men, all women must be so treated. And that's Christian doctrine. That did not exist until Christianity. The Hebrews were racist. The whole doctrine was racist. Maybe Moses wasn't. But what is transmitted as the Hebrew doctrine of the practice of Israel in ancient times was racist. In a time when racism prevailed throughout the earth. The first time the conception of a universality of man of every individual under the protection of God was Christianity. That's the origin of it. And every human being has that quality of made in the image of God. They're all born that way. And therefore, God is a Christian, because we believe that all men and women are each born with that divine quality which makes us all of one race, set apart from all other species to exert dominion in this universe. And that's what it means to be a Christian. That's the essential meaning. What do you think about man? What's your image of God? Well, that's a deeper question, which I also wrote about to some degree in that as in other locations, on this question of simultaneity of eternity, which is another very important principle in this, which is not original to me. This was actually standard Platonic theology among Christian fathers such as Augustine in ancient times. But that's another aspect of it. But essentially, in the essential question, are all men and women made in the image of God? Is racism contrary to God? Racism among human beings. Is that contrary to God? If you're a racist, can you be a Christian? No. You rejected God. You cannot be a racist. If someone is of a different religion, religious belief, can you reject them? You cannot reject them. Do you agree with everything they say? No. Do you agree with everything they say about religion? No. But as you, in your action toward that person, must be the action of a Christian. And you must treat them as in the image of God, no matter what your disagreements are. Huh?
Like I said, we are about to embark on a campaign for exoneration of Lyndon LaRouche. Should you choose to accept this mission, and we believe that you really don't have any choice because he, was unjustly treated, understand that there is a standard of thinking that is required, and you will be submitted to that test as you begin to talk about this matter. So I'd just like to thank everybody for being here. I want to again just reference again The Science of Christian Economy and other prison writings by Lyndon LaRouche, The Tour to New Council of Florence, and this week's EIR in particular, Italy joins the Silk Road as Trump challenges climate fraud. And one final thing, which is available from us also, is the LaRouche 40-year record, A New International Economic Order. So again, on behalf of LaRouche Political Action Committee, I want to thank everybody for being here, and that's going to conclude our webcast for this week.